What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor. I'm very fluffy today. It's like raining and my hair is just sort of doing things. But that's not today's topic. Today, now that I've had a little bit more time to poke at the endgame of Season of Discovery Phase 2, I want to talk about that a little bit, give some more coherent thoughts beyond just my first impressions that I gave out last week. Now, most of my first impressions from last week still hold. I haven't changed a ton of opinions, though some of them have evolved a little bit since then. So rather than spending a whole bunch of time rehashing everything that we talked about last week again, we're probably going to spend most of this video talking about Gnomeregan. And I also want to address a little bit of a continuation of a question that I brought up in the first impressions video last week, which is just kind of considering the idea of like, what does discovery really mean? And what is the target audience for things to be discovered by in Season of Discovery, especially now that we're into Phase 2. Now, before we go any further, I want to give a warning that spoilers will be in full effect for this episode, especially regarding Gnomeregan. I'm not going to be talking about runes too much in this one, just because we kind of talked about that a bunch last week already anyway. So I wouldn't worry about any rune spoilers or questline spoilers in this one, but I will definitely be talking a fair bit about Gnomeregan. So if you're still trying to keep yourself spoiler-free for Gnomeregan, this may be an episode to come back to in a few days. But before we get to Gnomeregan, there's a couple other topics that I want to hit first. And the first one of those that I want to talk about is really just the general lack of any reason to do dungeons at level 40. Like, depending on your class, and especially considering if you already had gear from Black Fathom Deeps, there's kind of no real reason. Like me as a Feral Druid, there is literally nothing for me in Scarlet Monastery, in Razorfen Downs, in any of the level 40 dungeons. In fact, coming off of Black Fathom Deeps, there have been 2 upgrades for me that are contained outside of the Gnomeregan raid, and they were both quest items from Feralis. And we kind of expected that this was going to be a problem, like especially looking at how good the BFD gear was. We kind of expected that coming into Gnomeregan, like coming into level 40 at least, that Gnomeregan was going to kind of be the only place to really get meaningful upgrades. It just still kind of sucks. Especially because they did go through the trouble of updating a whole bunch of pieces of gear from the Scarlet Monastery dungeons and similar dungeons in the same level bracket. They went through and upgraded a bunch of pieces, but they still suck compared to the BFD gear. And the biggest reason that's disappointing to me is just I really like the level 40 dungeons. Like Scarlet Monastery in particular, I wanted to be in there regularly, like farming for drops, hoping for gear. I wanted to be doing library and cathedral and an armory over and over and over again. Graveyard is whatever, but the other ones I really wanted to be farming those a bunch. I even like Razorfen Downs quite a bit, and there's like the beginning parts of Uldaman that could have been useful for drops as well. It's just none of that actually ended up being useful. And maybe the skill books might have been Blizzard attempting to address this by giving you something other than gear to farm these dungeons for. But they drop pretty quickly. It's like maybe 3 or 4 runs. At least for me, it was 3 or 4 runs before I had all 3 of mine that I needed for Druid. And even then, one of those I don't think should have been a book in the first place. I feel like that should have just been just a passive change that they made. But the problem that this is exposing is that outside of like a few rounds of Stranglethorn Veil to get whatever pieces from that you want, and I guess leveling alts, there's really nothing to do in Phase 2 except for Gnomeregan. And even then, leveling alts to me is less exciting this go around because of the way that runes are discovered in Phase 2. We talked about that a lot last week. I'm not going to go into it again. And also, like Stranglethorn Veil, again, we talked about this a lot last week, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here, other than just to say it's pretty much working out the way that I expected, which is fewer and fewer people are doing it, and also you only need to do it a few times anyway. Like, at least in my experience, I'm seeing fewer and fewer people in Stranglethorn Veil every time I go there. And that's likely for a lot of reasons. Like, part of it is that people just have the items that they need. Like, if you're only interested in that 1 5 silver coin item, you can literally get that in like 3 runs of Stranglethorn Veil tops, and then you're fine. I also think the health buffs that they pushed out last week have made being in a group way more important, because the more health you have, the more valuable having a healer becomes, and the easier it is for healers to keep you alive. So that makes being in a group way more important, which I think has led to a lot of people who don't want to bother joining a group just writing off the event entirely, which is probably resulting in fewer overall participants. So that just leaves Gnomeregan. Let's talk about it. One of the things I mentioned last week about Gnomeregan that surprised me is how complex some of the fights are. The encounters in Gnomeregan, especially the later fights, are pretty complicated, especially when you compare them to the fights in Black Fathom Deeps. Like, they're all still in line with what would be considered a classic style encounter. Like, there's nothing in there that didn't necessarily occur elsewhere inside of classic. they're just far more on the Naxxramas side of the spectrum than things were in Black Fathom Deeps. Now, when I say that, I'm mostly talking about the last 3 fights in the instance. The first 3 are still pretty straightforward, slightly more complicated than BFD, but can still pretty much be summarized in one sentence. For Grubbus, you kill the waves, you kite the little guys into the green stuff when you can, you off-tank and interrupt the Basilisk, and don't get farted on. For Viscous Fallout, don't stand in the green stuff, kill the ads immediately when they spawn, and try and slow and stun them if you can. And then Crowd Pummelers basically just don't get pummeled. Like, stay out from in front of him, avoid the gears, and heal whoever he grabs. But from there, we get a pretty big step up in difficulty. Like, Electrocutioner requires a lot of coordination. There's 2 different debuffs to manage and watch out for. You need to have careful positioning for all of those that are involved, and you really have to kind of coordinate your whole group. You can't just tell people, don't do this thing, and you're fine. The Menagerie also requires quite a bit of coordination. You're going to need to split up your DPS a bunch. You're going to need to be keeping track of everything's health. And also, there's just genuinely a ton of things going on the Menagerie fight, because there's 4 things, and they're all doing stuff constantly. And then Thermoplug has 4 phases. Well, technically 5. We don't really count the last one, but he's got 4 phases, all with their own mechanics going on that need to be figured out, all with different like ways that you can just up and die, depending on if someone does something wrong or not. Plus, you're dealing with the bombs and clicking the buttons the entire time. And on top of all of that, especially for those last couple of fights, there is a heavy need for ranged DPS, especially caster DPS in Gnomeregan. Like, Menagerie and Thermoplug are just way easier if the majority of your DPS are ranged. Even Electrocutioner is made easier by having more range than melee DPS. And on top of that, as a lot of you are probably already aware, the bosses in Gnomeregan have just an absurd amount of armor for some reason, which is nerfing physical DPS even more, on top of the fact that it's already more difficult to handle mechanics with too many melee in your group. Like, the sort of anecdote that people have been throwing around is, okay, these bosses have basically, there are 2 bosses that have the same amount of armor as Ragnaros and 2 bosses that have more armor than Ragnaros. And that's kind of the anecdote that people have been throwing around. But I was doing some digging when I was doing some research to put this episode together. And that armor value in Classic was pretty much the same all the way up through at least AQ40. I couldn't find numbers for Naxxramas, but at least all the way up through AQ40. The amount of armor that Ragnaros had is the same amount of armor that the Twin Emps and Cthulhu had. Which, yes, that does mean that Sicko Thermoplug has more armor than an old god. So not only is having melee DPS making things harder on you in terms of handling mechanics, it's also meaning that you're killing things slower. So you have to handle those mechanics longer. Except for some reason for melee hunters, on Tuesday, which is when I'm recording this, they just put a hotfix live that does something to Raptor Strike. I haven't wrapped my head around that yet. Maybe melee hunters are more in line with everyone else right now. They've been crazy, but whatever. That's just kind of a side thing. What's extra weird about this is I feel like they should have learned this lesson from Black Fathom Deeps. Remember when they rolled out BFD and casters were in this exact situation because everything in BFD just had absurd amounts of resistances for some reason. And then later on they said, oh, whoops, we shouldn't have done that. We've lowered the resistances that these enemies had. And suddenly caster DPS was able to thrive and actually be functional in Black Fathom Deeps. And a whole lot of people were like, yay, this is great. This is so much better now. Like, maybe they thought that they should make up for putting casters through that at the start of BFD by putting physical damage through that at the start of Gnomeregan, but that's a bit weird as a strategy, and I don't know that I'm convinced that's actually what they're doing here. It just feels like, I don't know, an unintentional oversight, perhaps? I don't know. I don't fully understand why it's the case, but it's definitely made it so that having too many melee in Gnomeregan is a problem. Now, even with all of these struggles and with all this extra complexity and with the melee versus range thing, it is worth noting that these fights aren't massively complicated, especially by modern standards. They're just a little bit of a surprising step up from Black Fathom Deeps. And some people have really loved that. I mean, complexity and your taste for it is all a subjective thing, right? So some people, I've seen lots of people actually saying how much they liked Thermoplug and how much they were really, really excited that he was such a complicated encounter. And like, oh man, this was such a good fight. I felt so good getting him down, blah, 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 etc. Some people are really, really into that. But one interesting trend to that I noticed was that of the people who, at least who I have seen saying, yes, I really, really like Gnomeregan, all of those people either looked up a guide themselves or had someone who looked up a guide tell them what to do. Which kind of brings me back to the concept of what is the discovery aspect of Season of Discovery supposed to be? Now, obviously, I don't have a problem with people looking up guides for a fight. Like, that's kind of been, that was how I got my career started, essentially, was making video guides. And even then, back when I was making the video guides that everyone used way back in the, Wrath of the Lich King Cataclysm days, back when I was making all those guides, I still spent a lot of my own time doing research ahead of time, looking up like data mining, talking to other people about their experiences on the fights, looking up other people's guild forums where they were talking about it and so on, like the Elitist Jerks forums back in the day. I spent a lot of time looking up information on fights ahead of time so that we could get in there and get through the bosses as easily as possible. That's what you do sometimes. It's just the sort of thing that in Season of Discovery specifically feels a little bit weird mostly because honestly, the developers have been doing so much to try to discourage people from spoiling themselves on things in advance. Like they're intentionally not testing this stuff on PTR because they want people to be surprised when they go in there for the first time. They keep saying things like, don't look at data mining, don't spoil the surprise for yourself. Like these are statements that they're actually making. So it feels a little weird that the people who seem to, at least from my perspective and anecdotally from what I've seen, the people who seem to have enjoyed Gnomeregan the most are the ones who did spoil themselves on it. Like, talking about my personal experience progressing through Gnomeregan and not looking up information on it ahead of time, the first few fights I thought were great. I actually really enjoyed the first 3 fights, and I was okay with Electrocutioner when we got to him. But the last couple fights in particular, when we killed those bosses, I didn't feel like happy or excited. I just felt relieved. I just felt like there was a lot of surprise, you're dead now sort of moments on those fights that were hard to analyze and figure out what exactly happened. It was a lot of just like, okay, I guess we finally accidentally stumbled our way through completing this boss fight instead of, oh, wow, okay, I figured it out. I understand now what we need to do. Let's do this thing and it works. Also, speaking of unenjoyed surprises, the interrupt on Phase 3 Thermoplug, I'm actually really glad that we got spoiled on that one. Fortunately, someone in our raid group had DBM running and also had an interrupt, and so just kicked it when the thing popped up and said that they should kick it. Otherwise, that would have just been an obnoxious thing to try to figure out. Like, when a challenge is, here's this mechanic and here's how it interacts with something else, and you've got to figure out how to deal with that interaction, that's a fun challenge to figure out. When the challenge is, the game is intentionally hiding the part of your UI that tells you what to do, that's... And I know that's not the first time that there's been a mechanic on a boss that is interruptible, but doesn't show that it can be interrupted. I know. I just don't like it. Now, again, all of this is just me and my personal experience going through Gnomeregan. I didn't really enjoy the back half of Gnomeregan. And it could just be that my personal experience wasn't great. Like, that happens from time to time. I was playing a melee DPS in a melee heavy group. So not only does this mean that I was not able to help with the mechanics that were the most difficult ones to deal with, I also literally just couldn't see what was happening half the time because I was staring at a boss that was taking up most of my screen. And there are, in fact, a few things that I've learned about some of these fights since we actually cleared through it that, had someone in the raid noticed them, would have made things a lot easier. And at the end of the day, we still cleared Gnomeregan with its more complicated encounters just as quickly as we cleared BFD. So it really wasn't overall a substantial outlier. It was just kind of a little bit more of a frustrating experience for me going through it. Speaking of which, let's talk about the raid lockout shenanigans. You remember a few weeks ago when they first announced that they were going to do the extended raid lockout for the first 2 rounds of Gnomeregan? I remember I said something to the effect of, yeah, this is an idea that sounds great on paper. I think it's a good idea. I'm glad they're trying it, but there could be reasons why in practice this doesn't work out to be great. Hindsight being hindsight, it didn't turn out to be great, at least in my opinion. Like, that first 5 days for the first lockout, at the time, I thought for sure, this is going to be, it's going to take me maybe 3 days to get to 40. And then after that, we'll have 2 days worth of progression time on Gnomeregan. This will be totally fine. In reality, what worked out was it just took me longer to get to 40 than I expected. It took pretty much everyone, I think, longer to get to 40 than they expected because that level band is just really, really grindy. Unless you were spamming Scarlet Monastery basically all the way to level 40, it took you a while to get there. And most people didn't really want to do that. So it was a case where it was long enough of a time period that felt like you could make it and you could take your time and be fine. But then towards the end of it, you still ended up feeling rushed because now you're close. You can get there in time, but you really, really, really need to pound out those last few levels. And even ignoring that first lockout, going into the second lockout, I feel like myself and a lot of other people overlooked the social implications of seeing the rest of your group of friends and the rest of the people that you've been playing with clearing Gnomeregan and getting to that max level stuff and doing all that max level content, which is really just Gnomeregan, as we've discussed in this episode, getting all that done before you even get there. Like, it's just the sort of thing that really takes the wind out of your sails. If you're saying, yeah, I'm going to take advantage of this extra time that Blizzard gave us, and I'm just going to be casual, and I'm going to, have fun on my way up to the top, and I will play a few hours each day, and it'll be fine, and I'll get to 40, and then we'll go into Gnomeregan, and not much will have been missed. I think people really feel like they ended up missing a lot. Plus, apparently, as we're learning again today, I'm recording this on Tuesday, apparently switching that lockout timer doesn't work very well anyway, because now we've ended up in a case where there's like this weird Tuesday, Wednesday lockout that you can get an extra clear in, and then the next lockout starts on Thursday or something. I don't know why it's worked out that way. It feels weird. They said something about how they've never tried to do this before, which is fair, they haven't. And how that's caused some weird issues that didn't come up in testing. I don't know. All I know is that I don't think this experiment really worked. So looking forward to phase 5 and whatever new raid content we theoretically receive at level 50. I really hope they look at this and just say, yeah, let's just give it a week off of the start and just just keep the raid closed for the first week and then go into whatever lockout they have. I'm still hoping, fingers crossed, that they don't do a 3-day lockout again in the future, because that's just too often. That's too many resets. But even if they do stick with a 3-day lockout, give us a week first, open it up when that timing then turns out to be realistic. I get that there's a bunch of very heavy, like, classic focus guilds that really want that massive rush to world first at whatever the level is and then immediately be able to go into the raid. I just think the majority of the player base, especially for a season where they're obviously very much trying to appeal to a wider audience, I think it's going to be more fun for the rest of us if they just give it that week. And it's ultimately a minor inconvenience for that group anyway. Anyway, that's enough ranting for this week. I'm going to go ahead and stuff myself in the Salter. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for tuning in. Reminder, I still have a streamathon ongoing. In fact, it's still going somehow. Because every 300 points we add a day, and you guys keep making me add more days, and I'm not complaining. I'm having a blast with it. So feel free to come by and check us out. That is live pretty much every day on twitch.tv/Devilor or here on YouTube. And a big shout out and thank you to my patrons as well. You can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Devilor. I am going to have the monthly update video in the next week and a half, thereabouts. That monthly update video will be coming very, very soon, where we're going to talk about all the stuff going on in March, plus some ideas I have for new content, and what we're doing with the Transmog Throwdown idea. I need to finalize some of my thoughts on that, but we'll have that video out in the very near future. Anyway, that's it for me. Thanks again so much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you next time.